Hello, everyone. Voice test 1 2 3. Voice test 1 2 3.
All good, all good.
Okay, we'll wait for a response from our correspondent to check if the live stream is working right.
Okay, we're good to go. We're good to go.
Yeah. All right then. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope that today's event is going to be a successful one. So what will we be doing today? We'll be having a debate exhibition. And what is debate? Mr. Sharwin, could you please go to the next slide first? So the purposes for us to organize today's exhibition is pretty simple. We had three goals in mind. Well, how did we get here? The first thing was that Miss Elizabeth contacted us for debate classes for her son. And that's how we got in touch. And after she let us know that she managed a Facebook group with parents, we thought that this was a good opportunity to perhaps introduce debate to more people. There's a few misconceptions with debate that exist currently right now. Primarily that it is argumentative, that there are a lot of fighting and arguing and people always clashing and getting angry. So we wanted to dissolve these ideas. We didn't want there to be stereotypes surrounding debate. So what do we aim to do with today's exhibition? The first thing is we want to introduce the idea of civil discussion. How do we discuss potentially very controversial topics in a civil way that allows people to actually learn from one another, learn different perspectives, and perhaps even learn about the topic itself that they're discussing. The second is the importance of discourse itself and the exchanges of ideas. The importance of this is, of course, very clear. Discussions are important for us to come to conclusions, to make decisions. And we think that a civil debate is the best way to do this. Thirdly, we think that in particular about students and students debating, especially the younger ones, we think that the academic sport of debate and public speaking really teaches them to make coherent and sophisticated arguments. So who are we? Why should you listen to the five of us, or rather, why are you tuning in today? Mr. Sharwin, could we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So who are we? Firstly, let me introduce our two debaters. We have Kyle Boonwaat. He currently studies economics at the University of Queensland. Very exceptional debater. He was a past student of ours, and you have all seen his credentials on the poster. Secondly, Rinakshie Rams. She currently just finished her A-levels at Sunway College, so still very young, but nonetheless a capable debater. We will also be hearing from her on this particular topic. Moving on, who are we, the moderators for today? Mr. Sharwin, the next slide, please. So firstly, my name is Ahmad Irfan. I am a Oxford and Cambridge public speaking champion. I've been training students since I was in high school, and we came together with my previous trainer, Mr. Sharwin Mohan, in the middle with a big smile, and he asked me to come train with him, and we've been doing that together ever since. Later on, our third founder with us, Mr. Nigel Umrich, he joined us, and the three of us have been conducting classes ever since. So the three of us will be moderating today's event, which primarily we have a hands-on approach. We want to let the debaters shine here. They will be the ones who made the arguments. The arguments will be live, meaning the speeches are not pre-recorded, neither are the speeches written out. They won't be reading from a piece of paper. All the arguments that you will see will be made, the arguments were pre-prepared, but the speeches will be made on the spot. So without further ado, let us jump straight into the debate. We'll give our debaters a few seconds to prepare.
Okay.
Okay, can we have everyone do a voice test first? Because this is a debate. It's very important that everyone can hear. Kyle, could you please do a voice test?
Hello, Kyle here. Testing 1, 2, 3. Everyone can hear me clearly?
Okay. Rinakshie, please.
Voice test 1, 2, 3.
Okay, brilliant. So firstly, an introduction to the topic very briefly. We wanted to have a discussion as to whether the government should subsidize privatized education. And on the two sides here, we'll have the debaters debating. So on one end, we will have the debater arguing about how the government should subsidize and why, and whether the government really should be using taxpayers' money to subsidize privatized education. So perhaps maybe to some controversial perspective. And on the other hand, we will have a debater arguing against the proposal. So we would want to say that the government does not use taxpayers' money to subsidize privatized education. So once everyone is ready, we will begin now. Mr. Sharwin, could you please switch to speaker view?
Can I begin?
Yep, all good.
Okay.
Yeah, just speak a bit louder so the audience can hear.
All right. Well, let me just time myself. Okay. The government cannot afford to pass and execute policies that jeopardize its education system, a sector meant to ensure a future prosperity of its nation and to provide basic right to its citizens. I think that it's irresponsible for the government to overlook subsidizing international school and focusing on just the provision of public education, in which underperformance of its students have been stagnant for a really long time. And we can see this through the underperformance of students in the PISA exam scores, where Malaysia has been below the global average for over 10 years now. And we think that the government's aim should be to provide the best possible education options. And this shouldn't just look like the provision of public education system that they're only focusing on now. My speech will be split into the principal argument and the pragmatic argument as well. So firstly, why is it principally justified? The majority of tax money comes from high income earners, and this tax money is channeled into public schools where they don't directly benefit from. Hence, the government should uphold the social contract with high-income earners by making viable education options more accessible to these individuals, especially to middle-income earners who cannot afford the schools yet pay a hefty sum of tax. Because these international schools that we frame in this debate look like ISKL, Sunway International School, and Taylor's International School as well, where a lot of wealthy kids go there. And the second argument is on how better education is provided, because cheaper fees just mean that more individuals are able to enroll in this better school system. So there are 4 reasons why international schools outsourcing education to them is good. Firstly, it's more efficient because they are quite profit oriented, in the sense that international schools want prestige, so they would want their students to have better test scores, so there's better teaching. It's more accountable because parents now become consumers who want value for money. Thirdly, because they are using international syllabus, for example, like the Singapore syllabus, which has managed to produce the top PISA scores, and also external exams like the IGCSEs and A levels, which managed to get students into very prestigious universities in the Russell Group and Ivy League. And we think that all of this, and the conclusion of this argument, is that a lot of individuals are now able to access these structures to have more successful careers and better access to tertiary education as well. And extending onto this argument, there's also the benefit to the nation if we follow the Sarawakian model of bonding students in these international schools to come back and work for them as well. My third argument would be on how public schools that still exist would be a lot better off as well. Because recognizing that public schools are still going to exist, yet there are going to be more people who enroll into international schools, means that poorer students in public schools are going to be a lot better off, because firstly, they don't have to fight or compete for the same resources like lab apparatus and textbooks. And secondly, classroom sizes will be much smaller, and we tend to underestimate this benefit on how it can produce conducive learning. And this means that like there's going to be better test scores and better access to tertiary education as well, which means this poor student who could previously only have scores enough to do his diploma could now like extend to doing a degree as well, which has a lot of impact, positive impacts as well. So in conclusion, we think that by subsidizing international school, we don't only make like the high income earners get better education, but for those who are still in public schools and have to be in public schools while reformation takes place, I think they would be a lot better off too. And that's why I very proudly propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Her arguments were for the proposition side of the debate, meaning she supported the idea of government subsidizing privatized education. Now, Kyle will provide the opposing view and provide the speech on opposition.
Sound check, Kyle, sound check.
Check.
Test.
Slightly louder, please.
Test, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, all good.
I think when we all read about Viviana Musibin's story of how she had to climb a tree in Sabah just so that she could sit for her final exams, those sounds like a very inspiring story, but it's actually very sad because it shows how transparent and badly needed more funding for our public education needs, and how it continuously disadvantages poor students like Viviana, and how if you were to fund international schools by using this subsidy, you're only going to push any sort of reforms that help students like Viviana into the dirt. I have two major arguments here today. But before that, let's just get three things straight. Firstly, where will this subsidy come from? Because let's not pretend like this subsidy is going to come out of thin air. This subsidy is obviously going to come out of a significant chunk of taxpayer money. And number two, the nature of these international schools, which are very, very expensive. So like, I'm not denying the quality of these international schools, but you cannot pretend that they are undoubtedly expensive and also really hard to enter because you require like really high grades to enter these schools. And lastly, on the nature of taxes, because Malaysia being a democratic country, the nature of taxes is required that's collected from people, and then they are rechanneled into funds and infrastructures that can benefit the most amount of people. And I think right there off the bat, you can already see that there is a contradiction, that this is a subsidy that everyone's taxpayer money will have to pay for, but only a small amount of people who can afford to send their children into international schools can benefit from. And I think we as Malaysians are very well accustomed as to seeing our taxpayer money going into places where it shouldn't. And if we see Rosmah buying one more Birkin bag, knowing very well where that money comes from, I think we Malaysians have every right to be upset. So what happens now? Now that we see richer communities will continue to enjoy these international schools, which are now also cheaper, regardless if these communities needed that better, cheaper education in the first place. And also, poorer communities will also remain in public schools. And now it is not only underfunded, but now they also have to share the same educational budget with the rest of international schools. So like there's a fixed pocket that the government has, and they now have to share it with all of these other subsidies. All of this, knowing that paying extra for international schools is a choice that a lot of these parents make on their own part and are in most cases already very okay with paying for it out of their own pocket. Number two, on proper educational reforms. There is a limited pool of resources where a specific allocated educated budget is set for all of these subsidies. And Now, with this subsidy, it becomes a lot harder to financially execute any of these potential educational reforms right now. And there are plenty of educational reforms already in place. For example, I have a brother in Form 3 in a government school as well, and he's already talked to me on how there's already reformed syllabuses in history, in Sejarah, and how there are also discussions on removing moral as a subject. Math is a lot harder now. What he's learning right now in Form 3 is something that I learned in Form 5. And also there's also discussions of putting applied sciences like technology and coding and stuff like that as a proper SPM subject. So there's already discussions and reforms that want to take place. But what do you do when you implement this subsidy? You cut off the financial ability of any of these schools being able to initiate these reforms. And also you postpone any of these reforms from actually materializing, because now that these discussions are being held in place, and now that this pocket allocated for public schools of having these reforms is also being shared with international schools, you make it a lot harder for them to materialize. And if they can materialize, it will take forever to actually do so. I'll end my speech for now with a popular quote from American businesswoman Lila Janal, that while talent is equally distributed, opportunity is not. And with this subsidy, you're further dividing this opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. So what we heard just now was a short speech from Kyle posing the topic. I would like to remind the audience that at any point, please feel free to post your questions in the chat and the comment section of the live post. We will have someone read out those comments after the debate. You can ask the questions generally, or you can direct the questions to either of the specific debaters. Now, the second part of the debate involves the response speeches, where both debaters will be responding to the arguments that they just heard, which means that both debaters just heard the arguments that were said live alongside you, and now they will be providing responses to those arguments as well live right now. So Rinakshie, please.
In response to Kyle, the government doesn't need more money to improve the access to education, because if you see in 2017, 98% of primary school students were enrolled in school, and 97% of secondary school students were enrolled in school as well. So these are really good numbers for Malaysia at the moment. And this, coupled with the fact that our current budget just for maintenance and for upgrading schools is around 735 million ringgit, which means that the problem that the Malaysian education system is facing isn't necessarily access, it's more on quality. And we think that by subsidizing international school, smaller classroom sizes, like I've explained earlier, would be more beneficial to poorer students, because of the fact that now you just have to buy less equipment for schools, or you just have to have less money to pay for this to pay for these students, right? So you can use all of the excess money that you have, and then conduct your reforms that Kyle wanted to mention about, like syllabus reforms and training better teachers. I think these things are more likely to happen when there are just less students in the school who are fighting for all of these resources. So school reformation becomes a lot easier as well. Secondly, on the idea of tax, because Kyle mentioned that we are taking tax money and we are spending it on something that's less urgent. But I personally think that because the government currently doesn't need extra money for its education sector, because of the fact that now we have excess money as well. Yeah, so that's how you can improve the education system. A case study I would like to include is how in India, because a majority of the middle income earners send their children to international and private schools, leaving up a lot of access capacity in public schools, which means lower income students from public schools have been doing a lot better, and they've been progressing in the past decade as well, and they're having more access to tertiary education because they're just simply less students per teacher, and there's just more resources freed up for these individuals as well. So that's entirely my response, because we think that by outsourcing it to private sector, you just generally make things more efficient for the education system. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rina. Those were her responses or rebuttals to Kyle's arguments. Now we will hear from Kyle and his responses to the arguments that Rina proposed in her previous speech.
Testing, testing. All good?
Yes.
So I have made 4 major rebuttals in response to Rina's speech, and I'll structure them into 4 different parts. Firstly, on better opportunities. Firstly, who gets to enter these international schools? Because Rina brought up this model currently being done in Sarawak, where they want to create more international schools completely funded. No, the construction of these international schools are completely funded by the government, and students will be picked from primary schools to enter these schools. And I think even from the get-go, there is already a bias or privilege of being selected into these schools, because you're being selected using things like your UPSR results. And that's just a problem. Privilege and inequality in education starts from a very young age, from as early as kindergarten. And if you're going to use primary school as a basis of who gets to go into premium education and who gets to go with the rest of them, I think that's already unethical in itself. Secondly, on the whole idea of scholarships. So scholarships is a funny thing, and I myself being a scholarship reject, I think scholarships are also a very funny investment, because why would you want to spend, a degree in the UK can cost about several 100,000 ringgit. Why would you want to spend all of that money for a long-term investment that can almost take about 5 years in secondary and another 4 in uni? So that's about 9 years education long investment, when you can use that money right now, especially for students who really need it in public schools. Imagine creating another classroom or creating another block or creating more textbooks. That's a more hands-on investment, and I think that's just a lot better. Secondly, on catering to richer communities that, because they contribute more to tax incomes, they deserve better catering into better education. Firstly, I think that there's a certain obligation to the state to people, and I think that obligation ends with the government giving you free public education. And I think that obligation ends there. If you want something more, I think you would have to pay for that. And I think that only makes sense. Secondly, I also think that's also a bit unethical to think so, because just because I were to pay more tax income, that also means I deserve better than people who can't afford to pay as much. So just because I pay more means I deserve more premiums. Thirdly, I also think you should consider the rest of the population that also provide a significant amount of income, because there's a 41.8%, it's a Gini coefficient that describes a really large income inequality in Malaysia. And this also describes that there's a huge chunk of other Malaysians that also contribute to income tax as well. So I think with this chunk being so significant, I think it's unethical for you to dismiss them just like that. Also, there's also, when you talked about how there is more incentive in private schools to get better grades, I also think that's not true. The thing about these public schools is that they just lack funding, but the incentive of wanting to help students is just as much and can be just as concentrated. And that's just a problem. Lesser quality textbooks, lesser textbooks in general, no school trips, and that becomes a lot harder for any of these things to materialize if you can only share these funds. And lastly, on how better resources available in international schools. Firstly, I have no doubt that these resources are efficient, but I think that these benefits are questionable if these great resources are only beneficial to the only small fraction of people that can actually benefit from it. So I think that in itself is questionable. So with all of that, I'd like to end with saying that the fight for better education is one that's really difficult. And whether or not you think it's worth to dismiss a larger amount of people to benefit a small amount of people, I think that's a question that you yourself have to answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. Mr. Sharwin, can we please switch to the conference view?
Yep, we're already in conference view.
Sorry, the gallery view for the speakers?
Yes, we're already in gallery view.
Okay, brilliant. So that concludes the speeches from the debaters themselves. Now, what we are going to do is we're just going to go through the questions that were posted in the comment section. we also had students who were watching the live stream and they sent us questions via WhatsApp groups as well. So we will be asking those too. The questions, debaters, feel free to just jump right in and answer. They don't necessarily have to be directed to either one of you. We'll take the first one here. So Hisham Hamza says that there is a difference between enrollment and attendance. Absenteeism is high, especially in rural areas, due to logistical and financial reasons. So in this debate, when we're talking about the government providing subsidies for international schools, does this change this problem that exists in rural areas? Even if the subsidy is provided, will the subsidies be able to have that trickle-down effect into the rural schools and improve the attendance rates there?
Personally, I don't think that it's gonna solve this issue of logistics and like just the idea of traveling to school is still going to be hard, because it also extends to other sectors and not just education, like housing and welfare. And these are not in control of like the education minister choosing to subsidize international schools. But then again, there is going to be some effect, because when there are just going to be less people in school, because like in rural schools as well, it's not like everyone there is very poor. There's going to be some middle income students learning there as well. And if like these students transfer to international schools, then there is some net effect over there. And even if it's a small one, I think that we tend to underestimate like the difference between just like 10-20 students being absent in a classroom and like moving to a different school. So that's my answer.
Okay, thank you, Rina. This second question is a more general one. What are some long-term benefits of debating? In your experience in debate classes and attending debate events, what benefits or skill sets have the both of you learned? Could you please share with us? We can start with Kyle.
I think the main benefit is that I get to work for Podium. No, I'm just kidding. So one of the main benefits that one of the ones that I use almost every single day is being able to communicate a lot better, because I'm currently in Australia, and naturally talking to a lot of foreigners, I get naturally intimidated with how fluent they are in English. And honestly, if it wasn't for debate, my confidence in myself and my fluency in the English language wouldn't have been as good. And I would never have been able to structure myself the way I am able to now. So the biggest part for me was instilling that huge slap in the face self-confidence that, you don't necessarily have to be the cream of the crop best debater in order to be a person who can properly express themselves. I think just by practicing the very skills that you also practice in debate, you also get to have not just better confidence in yourself, but you also get to be a bit more better fluent in the English language. And I think that's a plus.
Rina, do you want to give your insight on this?
Yeah. Like what Kyle said, it definitely boosts your confidence, but I think it also makes you well-read, because when you go into a debate tournament, it's just 30 minutes, you and two other people, without any gadgets, without any trainers there to help you, and suddenly they're giving you a motion about NATO, and you have to be well-read. And I think like just being in this academic sport kind of forces you to go out there and read about things and learn things you never even knew existed. And I think like that's been the best part about debating for me, because like I realize there's so much I don't know, and it's very intellectually stimulating in that sense.
All right, so let's go through some of the other questions. We have one here. Is it possible for the government to redirect the funds meant for the subsidy towards better public school infrastructure? So this debate wants the government to give money to private schools, but is it better for the government to just take that and perhaps build more classrooms so that maybe we can fix the overcrowding issue in public schools?
Personally, I feel like that's what it should be. And I'm sorry if I offend anyone, I do not think that any sort of government subsidy should be allocated towards private sectors, because And this has been apparent in many different other cases, that whenever there is a government subsidy that goes into a very profit-oriented private sector, there is always, at the end of the day, some sort of deadweight loss, or in other terms, economic efficiency. And that's when a private corporation can benefit from cheaper prices offered by the government. So this is why I think that in terms of government subsidies, it is always better to be providing it to people who need it the most. And the people who need it the most are usually also in government sector, like heavily government reliant sectors like government education and stuff like that. So I do think that's the way to go about it in terms of educational subsidies. Yeah.
We have another question here for Kyle. Seeing as the government already offers things like scholarships for underprivileged students, why is this subsidy so different?
Okay, so inherently, I think the very concept of scholarships can also be a bit controversial, especially to those that fund students to overseas countries for years and years. But secondly, I think that in terms of private education, where you are spending a lot more money on students that would not necessarily want to contribute back to the economy of the country, whereas for scholarships like GPA and other ones, for example, where there is a bond attached, after you finish your scholarship or after you finish the term of your study, you are required to come back and to work for the government or to work for whoever is sponsoring your study. And that token is supposed to mean that you are providing back to your country or providing back to helping build your economy, the very same economy that helps fund your studies. But inherently, I think that in terms of which one is better in terms of the bang for buck, or which one is better in terms of dollar value, I honestly think that if the dollars could be funneled into public education, I do think that is better. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll end with one last question for Rina. So, isn't it true that those who grew up studying in the environment of an international school usually end up studying abroad? And given this, they also look forward to studying abroad in the future, working abroad in the future as well. So doesn't this mean that the government will technically nurture the growth of those skills? So seeing as we are subsidizing international school with taxpayers' money, wouldn't that mean that they are then going overseas and we're going to work there as well? So there is no return on investment for the government.
The group that we are targeting using the policy of subsidizing international school are like upper middle class or just like the middle class income in general. And when these individuals, most likely they're going to switch from the public school system to the international school system. And I think that means that there's just a less of a likelihood for that to happen. But also, like in Sarawak, when they're trying to implement this policy, they are also having this, they also want to have this bond, like when these people go and they come back and they have to come back and work here. And I think that's something that the government should consider as well, because in the eyes of the government, it's also a form of investment to have like students who studied abroad coming back to work here. So I think that's a possibility that the government should explore when they want to subsidize international.
All right. There is one more question, and I think everyone can maybe jump in and try to answer this. How do parents encourage their children to try out debating? I think all of us have experience with little kids and trying to teach them, and they're not the easiest to convince to try something out like this. So how would you convince children to try it out? I think we can open this to everyone, including the moderators.
I'll go first.
Sure.
I think It doesn't necessarily have to be about global issues and whether or not they agree with Brexit or things like that. I think from the very core about things that interest them, on whether or not they think that Captain America or Iron Man is the better superhero, or whether or not they think that a certain villain is really the bad guy in a certain movie. And I think that once that many different kinds of children form these kinds of opinions, and once they have opinions, they can debate on those opinions. And then just by sparking those conversations, asking these children whether or not, do they really think so? And is that how you really feel? And if that's how you really feel, and if I think a certain different way, how are you gonna reason with me to tell me that you are right? I think that by having these mini conversations with children about things that interest them is what sparks things about debating. So I think that's a really neat thing that my mom personally did to me when I was younger. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to hop onto that really quickly, I think specifically for parents, especially, one of the things that almost all parents, I think, tend to notice about their children is that whether or not debates or arguments tend to happen in formal or informal settings, that they happen anyway, right? It could be something as simple as debating about why they can't play, their video games a little later than they otherwise should be allowed to. And, regardless of how much a child can or cannot develop their debating ability, what we have noticed almost always tends to develop with enough training is the fact that they are indeed able to reason, at least with themselves. So that's like a really nice, byproduct, and also serves to encourage the child gradually.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Nigel. I think I'll give my opinion a bit on this as well, and then Mr. Nigel will close our event for today. I think the easiest way to convince kids to try debating is to attend the class, to just get them to attend one class. And what we end up seeing is that kids naturally tend to like talking and arguing and talking to one another and screaming across the classroom. And once they get a bit more comfortable with this class, and then they go like, oh, okay, maybe this class isn't too bad, because all I do is just talk when I go to class, and they tend to like that. So they tend to look forward to just talking to their friends on the weekends, but without realizing that what's actually happening in class is that they're slowly learning the skills to put together coherent arguments, to stop saying things like, oh, you're wrong because you look funny because you're wearing an ugly shirt. Because that's unfortunately in all arenas in today's environment, we see that that's what the debates usually devolve into. It usually devolves into name calling and saying that, oh, you're wrong because you're from a certain background, or what do you know about this, or what do you know about that, without really analyzing and looking into the details of the arguments made. So eventually, once the students realize that they can also make persuasive arguments, and that they are in an environment where people are more willing to listen to them because it's a regulated, safe space for them to discuss these issues, they end up just liking class after that. So yeah, I think we can move on to the debriefing session. So we just had the debate. There was information said in this debate. We want Mr. Nigel to just debrief us on the debate, what was said, and to close the event for today. Mr. Nigel?
Yeah. Thank you, Irfan. Yeah, so thank you again, everyone who tuned in for our very, very brief but very insightful debate. And we appreciate you taking your time off to come and witness our debaters. So, I just want to stress just a few things, because we have noticed in the past that oftentimes with debating, sometimes we can't help but to tread on very, very sensitive issues. And, we as debaters, we do our very best to be as unbiased and without prejudice as possible. So first, I just want to let everyone know that anything that was said in the debate is not representative of the debaters or of the MIS PSG group that you joined in for just now. Our debaters craft and design these arguments specifically for the intention and the purpose of just having a good debate, engaging in a good discussion that stimulates, the intellect of both the audience as well as the debaters themselves. The other thing as well is that we always, before any given motion or topic, we always try to do as much research and fact-checking as we possibly can. Understanding, of course, that in a real-life debate scenario or real-life debate situation, you are given between 15 and 30 minutes to come up with the most powerful arguments that you possibly can. So that time slot in many ways is what makes debaters stand out, because not only do you have to think on your feet, but you actually have to come up with arguments that have logical conclusions and good reasoning behind it as well. Yeah. So if anything that was said, did not necessarily coincide with what you understand on the motion itself, we apologize. At the same time, we hope that you had a really good time listening to our speakers. Thank you, everyone.
With that, we'll be ending today's session. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in. Feel free to continue posting questions if you do in the comment section. We will be looking through the comment sections later today, and we'll try our best to answer all the questions. Also, please do feel free to contact the administration for the Facebook group. They will also be more than happy to answer any questions about the debate itself and the event that we had today. With that, I would like to thank everyone and see you soon. Please stay safe. Bye-bye.